first, let's look a little bit at the people who are behind, if you like, the CPCCA. I would say the principal figure is Professor Erwin Kotler. And as I document in the introduction, this is a project that he's been engaged in since at least 2002, and in direct response to the Second Intifada and to the Durban Conference on Racism. He initially attempted to set up something called the International Commission to Combat Antisemitism, ICCA, in collaboration with the Israeli Foreign Ministry. It didn't work because the organization that he envisaged was gigantically top-heavy. More importantly, the response of the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, was, this isn't going to fly. Abraham Foxman said, look, if you want to set up something like this, it shouldn't have the fingerprints of the Israeli state. It should be independent, separate from the Israeli state, which I think is a quite proper position to take. Although he smudged it a little bit because the journalist with whom he was speaking also quotes from him the statement that it's a little ambiguous. I have a footnote to this effect. The words are not in quotation marks, so it's not clear that they're actually Foxman's precise words, and yet they're attributed to him. He said there are organizations like ours that can do the dirty work. Those seem to be his terms. Now, what emerged in 2009 was a slightly differently named ICCA. This time, Interparliamentary Coalition to Combat Antisemitism. It met in London, England, in February 2009. It brought together parliamentarians from different countries. There was a group shepherded there by Professor Kotler and Jason Kenney. In my introduction, I characterized Professor Kotler's positions on these issues as extremist, which isn't a term I use lightly. I call him extremist because in advance of the publication of Judge Richard Goldstone's United Nations report on the events in Gaza, a report in which, as Goldstone said, at the time of accepting this job from the United Nations, he said, we're going to look at at what was done by both sides, and he was scrupulous always in mentioning both sides. He wanted to interview victims in Israel, and he wanted to interview victims in Gaza. And I think his report is also scrupulous in this regard. He says, and he underlines it, and I think it's something we should all underline, that it is a war crime to attack civilians. What Professor Kotler did was to smear Judge Goldstone in advance of to in effect stain the reception of his report by saying, it's going to be biased, it's going to be this, it's going to be that, it'll be crooked if it doesn't come to these conclusions. And he had a second piece in which he basically recited all of the claims made by government propagandists in Israel to the effect that you can't trust what Gazans say because they're under the control of a terrorist government. Now, interestingly, Kenneth Roth, the director of Human Rights Watch, was so outraged by this, he wrote an immediate response denouncing this smear and saying, Professor Kotler and the Israeli government are very happy to quote my organization when we cite criminal acts committed by the governing force in Gaza, Hamas, against Palestinian people. They say, oh, yeah, sure, Palestinians are telling us the truth there. But when we quote Palestinians saying, my mother-in-law and my children, were killed by Israeli soldiers in this situation, they must be lying because, etc. So it's on account of that kind of smear that I apply the term extremist. The term is more easily applied to Jason Kenney because he's noisier. And I refer to one instance only, which is his denunciation of the NGO Kairos. Kairos, as you probably know, is a Canadian human rights NGO that for 35 years has had contracts with the Canadian International Development Agency. And its work has included It's not by no means been confined to work in Palestine, but it's included work in Palestine. And Kenny accused them of racism. He said, we're cutting off funding to them effectively because they're anti-Semites. Now, what he was saying is that a group that is closely affiliated with and effectively representative of 11 Canadian mainstream church groups is anti-Semitic. I take that to be, well, it was both false. His claim was made on the basis of Kairos's purported support for boycott, divestments, and sanctions, which is, as you probably know, advanced internationally as a peaceful means of exerting pressure on Israel to come to its senses. In fact, Kairos doesn't support BDS, and they've said so explicitly. They're working toward the same goals, but they don't support that strategy. So he was not merely misinformed, to be kind, or lying. He was adopting a position that is one that I think most Canadians would agree is seriously extremist. What can Canadians do? Well, I think one thing we can do is attend to the kind of rhetorical shell game that's underway. I think we need to, in attending to that shell game, we need also to remember the history and remember the sensitivities of the Jewish community to that history. People don't forget. The memories are recent. The memories of anti-Semitism, and they're dealt with by, again, some of the contributors in this book. People, I'm in my early 60s, people younger than me, I remember anti-Semitism being rife in Toronto when I was a kid, and racist slurs of all kinds. But people who, in a childhood in, let's say, Oshawa, Ontario, endured torment and remember it. Institution, it's not merely the anti-Semitism of individual viciousness, which is appalling, but an anti-Semitism that was institutionally instantiated, was present until the early 60s. It is the case that at this moment, activists in France are before a court accused of hate crimes for having distributed pamphlets advocating boycott, divestment, sanctions as a peaceful solution. They're part of an organization that's been very vocal in saying we oppose all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism most distinctly. They're facing court charges in France on hate speech. And another activist is appealing a 1,000 euro fine that was imposed on her in February in southern France in a court in Bordeaux for the crime of having stuck on a fruit juice container from Israel a little sticker saying, boycott Israel. Now, that may seem extreme, but there we are. By my analysis, what's involved here is a kind of perverse feedback mechanism. If you believe Benjamin Netanyahu, when he stands up, as he did, for example, at the Auschwitz memorial services recently, when he says, I stand before you as the leader of the Jewish state and the leader of the Jewish people.
He did?
He did. And he has been introduced also at events in the United States as, welcome to Prime Minister Netanyahu, the leader of the Jewish people. Now, what does that suggest to us? Well, what does that suggest, let's say, to an angry 16-year-old who may be himself of Palestinian descent or Muslim, or who knows that there are grievous wrongs being perpetrated against people with whom he identifies strongly and knows that they are thousands of miles away? But if it is true, as mainstream Jewish organizations persist in claiming that, Canadian Jews are solidly behind this, or French Jews are 95% in support of, the Gaza attack, the obvious potential perverse feedback that's set in motion is that people who are, they needn't actually be exposed, I think, even to the toxic poisons of, neo-Nazism, which, you can find that so quickly on the net if you're looking for it. It could simply be a kind of gut reaction that they go out and throw a stone through the window of a synagogue. Or a bunch of kids, sort of with that bravado of 16-year-olds say, you know, that guy looks like a Jew. I had a colleague of mine who happens to be a Scot. For some reason, a gang of kids in downtown Toronto thought he looked Jewish. He wasn't assaulted, but as they drove by, they emptied this torrent of anti-Semitic abuse on him. His name actually is Campbell. Watch it, Brian. So, patience, goodwill. I think these are among the ways that one can separate the neo-Nazis from other people who criticize Israel. In the concluding part of the book, say that there are clear genocidal intentions expressed by current senior Israeli politicians and academics. Martin Kramer is the principal academic guilty of this. When they say, for example, that they want to starve the Gazans into altering their political views, or they deliberately want to take action that will result in a reduction in the number of young Gazans, i.e. reduce the birth rate. That under the Genocide Convention is genocidal. I would say that, and here I kind of defer to people like Sir Gerald Kaufman, the British MP, who's I think he's the senior member of Parliament in the British House of Commons, and certainly the senior Jewish statesman in Britain, with a very distinguished record. And a record that includes, as he said in his speech to the House of Commons at the time of the attack on Gaza, included friendship with Ben-Gurion, with Alba Eben, with Golda Meir, with other stateswomen. And he said, as a matter of fact, the tie-pin I'm wearing was a gift from an Israeli friend made out of medals that he won in 3 different wars, and gave to me as a gift. So this is somebody with and he says he has a lifelong history. He was brought up within Zionism and has family in Israel and so on. And he then says, and it's a sort of interesting turn in this short speech, it's only several paragraphs long. He says that his grandmother died in the Polish city of Staszów. She was ill in bed, and she was murdered in her sickbed by a Nazi soldier. And he then, with a sort of breathtaking leap, says, my grandmother did not die in order that Israeli soldiers could go into Gaza and kill Palestinian grandmothers. I think that one does need to acknowledge that there is this element of difference in any analogy, and one also has to acknowledge that human thought works through the negotiation of differences and similarities, and through analogies, and that what I think what people need to attend to in particular is the question of whether, when actions are taken by servants of the Israeli state, that someone like Kaufman can plausibly compare to horrors of the Shoah, or that other people can compare, I think, quite legitimately, the imprisonment of the Gazans to the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto, not in its final moments, but certainly to that. Now, I think what one needs to do is to ask people, look, if this comparison, if this analogy is not entirely lunatic, and some people will say it is, back away, you self-hating Jew or you anti-Semite, in which case the conversation really can't go anywhere. But if people are willing to acknowledge that serious people, like Kaufman, let's say, are drawn, I'm sure not willingly, into that kind of analogy, one should ask them, how does this comport with your sense of ethics and your sense of what your Jewishness, the prophetic principles of, etc. Are we running out of time?
We're out of time. And I want to thank you for